So in today's video, I'll be discussing 5 things Capcom should avoid doing in Resident Evil 8 DLC. Now, as of making this video, we have no official release date or word on what Resident Evil 8 DLC will consist of. Now, I do want to preface this video by stating that these 5 things that I'm going to be listing are just my opinions, and it is just me theorizing since I don't have any evidence to support the 5 things on this list, hence the reason this is just a theory video. So if you don't agree with me, then that's okay. Like I said, this is all just purely theoretical, but I also want to make it very clear that if by any chance the things that I do mention on this list do end up being part of the DLC, it doesn't mean that I'll just refuse to play it or that I'll hate it right from the get-go, since I actually really liked Resident Evil 8 and I'm still going to play the DLC regardless. But in any case, let's get started. Alright, so number 1. Now the first thing that I think that the Resident Evil 8 developers should avoid focusing on in their upcoming DLC is having us play as Mia. Now Mia didn't actually have a huge role in Resident Evil 8 compared to her role in Resident Evil 7. We actually don't get to see Mia until we play as Chris and reach Miranda's lab/dungeon area, or we can assume that she's been locked up during the whole events of Resident Evil 8. Now on one hand, it would add to the story if we did see the events of how Mia got kidnapped in the first place. It would also be interesting if we got to see her during the events of Resident Evil 8 trying to escape her prison and just miss Ethan by a couple of minutes, and we got to see her get re-kidnapped again and locked up. But it would also add to the lore of Resident Evil 8 if we got to see Miranda and Mia having a conversation together, since they did know each other prior to the events of Resident Evil 8. But I still think that this idea should be avoided. I personally think that we could get another more interesting story that could be used in Resident Evil 8 DLC. Number 2. The next thing that should be avoided in my opinion is that I don't want to play as Ethan Winters again, since he's dead. Now funny enough, I actually did end up theorizing that Ethan would die in Resident Evil 8 way before the game released, and it was actually one of my first theory videos to actually come true. Now the only reason that I would feel okay with playing as Ethan again is something I'll go and talk more about in my follow-up video that'll be the opposite of this video, so I guess 5 things Resident Evil 8 DLC should do. But going back to what I was saying, the reason I don't want to play as Ethan is because I think his story ended in a good place. I honestly feel if we played as Ethan again in the DLC, it would kind of be disappointing depending on how Capcom does it. But I feel that this upcoming DLC, the developers have the potential to tell us a different story using a different character perhaps during the events of Resident Evil 8, and playing as Ethan again would kind of be a wasted opportunity unless it's done in an interesting way, which I also have theories for, but as mentioned before, I'll go over that in my follow-up video. But that's the only reason I think that this topic should be avoided in the upcoming Resident Evil 8 DLC. Also, side note, for those of you that don't know, I actually never really liked Ethan as a character, and I also hated the fact that we never got to see this guy's face. But anyways, number 3. The next thing that I believe should be avoided is I don't want to play as some random character like a random villager like what occurred in the Maiden demo. You know, in the Maiden demo, we just played as a random chick that ended up dying at the end. Now, I don't want to play as a random villager running around the village or Castle Dimitrescu before the events of Resident Evil start. Now, the reason I mentioned this DLC topic is because I think it is a possibility, because when we first get to the village with Ethan, it's actually after the outbreak or / like an attack occurs. It's not during. So it would add to the lore and story of Resident Evil 8, but the only thing that this would accomplish is it would just show us how life was like from the locals in a normal day-to-day life and seeing it all fall to pieces, much like in the typical Resident Evil outbreak fashion. And if you guys do remember, when traversing through the village, we actually did stumble on a massive amounts of dead bodies, so this village was well populated. But then again, I believe it would be a wasted opportunity for the developers to use this topic as a DLC, and as of making this video, we don't even know if we're getting several DLCs. Now my guess is we're probably going to get 2 story-focused DLCs, but that's just my theory, so if that does end up being the case, then I don't think that this one deserves a spot. Also, if this is your first time here, consider subscribing because I post Resident Evil videos every single week. Number 4. Now the next thing that I think that the Resident Evil 8 developers should avoid focusing on in their upcoming DLC is having us play as one of the villains of Resident Evil 8, like the 4 lords, like Heisenberg, Lady Dimitrescu, Moreau, or Donna, or even Miranda. So on one hand, I think it would be interesting to play as these characters, since during my playthrough of Resident Evil 8, I did feel that these characters could have used more screen time, especially when it comes to Lady Dimitrescu, since there was a huge amount of hype surrounding her before the game launched, but when you actually play the games, she's literally like the first boss fight, and it ends pretty quick, which was very anticlimactic. But on the other hand, I doubt that this would ever happen since we've never had a DLC to my knowledge where we play as a villain in the game. games. Again, it would be interesting, but ultimately it wouldn't add much since we already know that these villains are dead. Also, the same could be said with the DLC showing us more screen time of Miranda during her early years of developing a cure for her daughter. This would only add to the lore, but it would be quite disappointing in my opinion, since again, we already know that these characters are already dead, so the only thing that it would end up accomplishing is just adding to the lore. Now, I'd rather have something new rather than retrace our steps with Resident Evil 8. Number 5. Now, the last thing I believe that the developers of Resident Evil 8 should avoid in their DLC is going way into the future, like the glimpse we got of Ethan's daughter Rose at the end of the story. Since I'm pretty much done with the Winteresses, especially since we never even got to see Ethan's face as mentioned before, and as a character, he was pretty much on the lame side. But of course, this is just my opinion. I know that a lot of people like Ethan, but for me personally, I'm glad that that story of the Winters family got resolved. I don't really want another chapter. Also, I believe the only reason we actually got to see way off into the future was only for the sole purpose of showing us a conclusion to the Winters family story, since every main Resident Evil character would be around their 70s at this point. I mean, we did get the exact year of when we see Rose in the final cutscene, but all we do know for sure is that she's still a kid, since that's what her bodyguard or driver mentions. So I'm assuming she's a teenager, so I think it's safe to assume that the year is probably past 2034. Again, this is just an educated guess since Resident Evil 8 does take place in 2021 and Rose was a baby during that time. But what it boils down to is, I don't know how I'd feel knowing that all of my favorite Resident Evil characters are all hanging around a retirement home looking for medication with their life alerts on. Like, I don't want to picture Leon and Chris being like, "Help, I've fallen and I can't get up." Ooh. Now, I think the only Resident Evil characters that could still be in the game of preventing outbreaks is probably Sherry and Jake, so for that reason, I think going off way into the future should be avoided at all costs. But anyways, what did you guys think about my list of things I think the Resident Evil 8 developers should avoid using in their upcoming DLC? Do you agree with me, or do you guys disagree with me? I also want to reiterate that these are just 100% just my theories, and I have no evidence to support any of this, but I'll pass the question off to you guys, the Resident Evil community. Now let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Also, if you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to knife that like button. If this is your first time here, consider shooting that subscribe button in the face, and also remember to punch that notification bell like Chris punches that boulder in RE5 so that you guys never miss a video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one when you return to the world of Resident Evil.
The right to be a god. That right is now mine.